It's true that I rarely agree with a word that comes out of the mouth of the member who's just sat down. It is also true that I would not wish his recent health episode on him or anybody. But I do marvel, Mr. Speaker, at how he is able to take that life-threatening situation and weave it into any piece of legislation that is currently before the House. That is admirable. And I can. Yeah. The minister interjects to see whether Mr. Hinari could do that on the legislation bill, but I'm sure he will find some tangential relevance. However, Mr. Speaker, I want to speak to the bit of this set of legislation that we're looking at the moment that repeals the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act. And I want to say 4 things about infrastructure, because this bill, Mr. Speaker, originally presented itself as part of the infrastructure legislation. And it seems to me that housing, if this government were even halfway serious about investing in infrastructure, would be a prime objective for the government. Housing clearly provides shelter. It provides more than that. It provides security. Where people are able to buy their own home, it provides a sense of home ownership which gives a feeling of investment in a community. It provides security for communities as well as for families on their own. Mr. Speaker, the possibility of moving towards affordable housing is diminished by the repeal of this legislation. I'm not simply saying this because it was my legislation when I was the Minister of Housing, Mr. Speaker, but I'm saying it because it is one of a series of tools in the toolkit to help address the spiralling cost of housing that we saw happening in the 2000s, particularly from 2002 to 2007. That escalation of prices, brought about in large part by the escalation of the value of land, caused an inflation in house prices that led people to borrow in unrealistic terms on the basis of an inflated asset. We are now seeing more mortgagee sales than we have ever seen, Mr. Speaker. We are still seeing housing affordability out of the grasp of young families. We are seeing more and more young families who would aspire to be first homeowners unable to realise that dream, a dream that has been fundamental and quite central to the Kiwi dream. And we are seeing with the repeal of this legislation one of the tools in that toolkit for combating housing affordability problems taken away. More than that, Mr. Speaker, if this government was serious about infrastructure, it would realise that investment in housing has multifaceted benefits for our families, our communities, our society. Jobs could be created if the government was serious about tackling the problem of housing affordability. Under the Labour government, we were keen to release Crown land in order to build affordable houses. If the government retained the value of the land, but people could afford to buy the house, that was one way of getting into home ownership, which we proposed in 2008. I also announced in 2008 the shared equity scheme, which allowed houses on the private market to be subsidised by government over a period of time, by government putting in some money, by young families in particular being able to afford some contribution and being able to buy out the government's share over time as their circumstances improved. All of these were efforts that together provided a web, a toolbox of things that could help New Zealand families to achieve their dream of home ownership. But not only would an investment in housing and the building of houses create jobs, Mr. Speaker, but it would also create education and training opportunities through apprenticeships. This is another area that has been let slide by this government. It is not focusing on job creation. It's not focusing on the kinds of skills that our young people need in order to equip themselves to participate in society, in order to equip themselves to get a job. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to some of the submissions that were made on the bill in its original form. The Human Rights Commission said affordable housing was a critical component of having an adequate standard of living, and it regrets that the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act is being repealed without anything else in place to replace it. Age Concern said that it wanted to register its disapproval of what appears to be a process of repeal by stealth, burying the repeal of this piece of legislation inside an infrastructure bill so that the consequences for affordable housing could be disguised or glossed over by this government. Age Concern went on to say that the Affordable Housing Act has been in force for just a year, hardly enough time to determine whether or not it was working. High housing costs relative to income are often associated with severe financial difficulty, which leaves households with insufficient income to meet other needs such as food, clothing, transport, medical care and education. And that's Age Concern, looking at grandchildren perhaps who are wanting to strike out and own their first home. The National Council of Women said that they were concerned that a previously laudable section on restricted covenants had been watered down in the revisions to the Properties Act in the bill. The Auckland Regional Public Health Service said that it was premature to repeal the Affordable Housing Act until there was clear evidence that the housing market is delivering substantially increased numbers of affordable houses. And the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services said that the decision to repeal existing legislation was based on an internal review conducted by the New Zealand Housing Corporation that hadn't been made public, and they said that that was an insufficient basis for repealing the whole Act. Mr. Speaker, these are not left-wingers, these are not people on the margins of society, but these are groups who work with people who are on the margins of society. These people form the conscience of our society, and this government is choosing in the repeal of this legislation to ignore that conscience, and New Zealanders, particularly young families, will be worse off because of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.